invite คุณขวัญพัฒน์สุทธิธรรมกิจ the country officers of the World Bank Thailand. We have here Kun Jeff with us, who is the PPP specialist from the World Bank, coming together with here in the meeting today with us. So for those who are not familiar with English, just do what the MC has suggested you to. So I'd like to thank Ajahn Mam and Ajahn Chan and also PMUA for the chance for the World Bank to come here and exchange our views. I would like to give a brief introduction. I understand that many of you may have heard about the World Bank, but you perhaps do not know what the World Bank does. And if I were to explain this, it would take an hour or so, but I will just give a brief introduction. The World Bank is a bank, but we are not a commercial bank, but we are a bank for development bank. And we do give out loans for governments in the world for different governments. We have offices in over 170 countries around the world, including Thailand. And Thailand doesn't take lending so much recently in the past 10 years. That we don't, because we have good liquidity in the country, and therefore we do not have to rely on the funding from the World Bank. But because due to the fact that we're a development bank, the main mission includes these two things. First, reduce poverty, and secondly, reduce the disparity or inequality. When we talk about these two things, our work covers many different areas, including economy, social welfare, education, environment, and etc. And also energy as well. But today, what I would like you to discuss with us about why we're interested on the city development topic. It's because city development does have a direct impact on poverty and discrepancy and inequality. When we talk about city development, we think about Bangkok. If you follow the news, you will see that, okay, if there's a big city, then there's the problems. And so all the mayors who are sitting here, you all have your own problems. And the other day, I listened to the specialists and experts discussing, we have a new governor, right? There are a number of problems in Bangkok. And I was thinking, why are we only looking just at Bangkok? Because Bangkok's problem is the national problem, is that right? Or the national problems are concentrated in Bangkok? How do we actually, if you ask me how to solve Bangkok's problem, then we have to build a city outside of Bangkok. From other countries' experience, the government will try to build the secondary cities that's not the main cities, right? They're not going to say, okay, we're going to build city A, B, C. They would not pinpoint it like that. But what they're building is the infrastructure for two benefits, so that people can, there could be movement of people in human and movement of capital, so that it's not concentrated in one area. So if the government wants to develop the economy, how would you do it without people? How would you do it without capital? How would you do it with the people, but without capital? Without the infrastructure, you can't do it. And so to create good economy, create income, you have to have the infrastructure. So if you don't have these things, what would happen is that the big cities will follow what would do exactly the same mistakes as Bangkok. And then we would have to talk about problems in Phuket, Chiang Mai, Rayong, because the problems will be more or less the same, because we do not have the infrastructure to accommodate the growth of that city. And so the World Bank does have an interest on this matter. And we have been discussing in the morning that, okay, infrastructure is important, but as a person who's working in the local administrative organization, there's a limitation in terms of structure and also resources. But in terms of resources, Kun Jeff will talk about this morning. We already listened to the perspective from SEPO, State Enterprise Policy Office, but today we will listen from Kun Jeff about the perspective from other countries, because they have gone and progressed quite far in the past 15 years. Everyone knows that to achieve sustainable development, only public resources or resources from the government is not sufficient. We also need resources from the private sector as well. And therefore, PPP is increasingly important. And so we'll see that Thailand is using the PPP knowledge and adopting this knowledge to respond to the sustainable development goal. So that's why we're interested in this matter or this topic as a World Bank. Jeff has been waiting for a long time. I can't go further, otherwise he'd get really upset. So over to you, Kun Jeff, to start the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kun Kwan. And I will put up my slides in just a second. I want to note, if you all see the photograph that's on the screen of me and Kun Kwan, and I want to complain because Kun Kwan looks really good. He looks chic and in his suit and he's looking beautiful, and I look like I have no neck and I'm lounging backwards. And Kun Kwan set me up. He put this photograph up without asking me first. So I just want to register my complaint. So anyway, let me put some slides up. So I have a fantastic job in the World Bank. My name is Jeff, by the way. I work at the World Bank based in Singapore. And I have a fantastic job. I get to run around the world and work with and talk to people such as yourselves and share all the different things that I've seen around the world. I was just doing a little count. I've worked in 59 different countries, talking about PPP, working on PPP projects, and which is all fantastic and really exciting. Everywhere I go, I learn new things. So I'm looking forward to learning new things from you here today. I hope that we will have a lot of conversation, a lot of questions. As I'm speaking, please feel free to raise your hand, ask a question, interrupt, whatever you'd like, because the more questions you have, the more interesting the discussion gets, and the better I can understand where you would like to dive into some of these topics. I would also like to apologize for my complete lack of Thai language. And to the translators, I hope I'm going slowly enough, but again, to the translators, please let me know if I'm going too quickly. I will try to pause a bit more. My name is Jeff. Before I joined the World Bank, I spent 11 years in the private sector. I used to be a lawyer. I guess I still am a lawyer. I spent 11 years in big law firms in London and Paris, advising investors and banks when they invested in PPP projects in developing countries. And I did a bit of work in Europe and developed countries as well. But what my passion has always been developing countries. And then I think it's 17 years ago now, I moved to the World Bank. And now I advise governments 100% and help governments think through how they need to change things, what they need to do to attract private investment into infrastructure and to set up systems that will make private sector more available, but also protect the government from some of the tricky bits of bringing in private investment. So what I would like to talk to you today is about a little bit how cities can engage with the private sector and how we can create these partnerships to deliver better infrastructure. So if that's okay as a topic, any other business, let me know, but otherwise I will dive in. So government context, and especially with cities. This is a very difficult topic, cities have so much work to do, have so many different things that they need to deliver, so many different opportunities to make their cities stronger, more jobs, more opportunities, more economic development, more education, better healthcare. So many different things that cities need to do. And of course, cities only have so much money. They only have so much capacity to deliver these projects. And so it's very difficult for cities to do as much as they would like to do. One way of helping to do more is by bringing in private partnerships. Now, the idea of the private partnerships is really twofold. Number one is efficiency. Private investment should deliver better efficiency, should deliver more services, should bring new technology, new methodologies. When we bring in private sector, the result should be bigger and better than we could get if we just had public sector. And the idea being that public sector is good at some things, private sector is good at some things, and together, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Together, they can do even more, even better. Now, that sounds really easy, sounds nice and simple, but it's very, very complicated. So that's one part, is together we can do more efficiency. The second part is money, is capital. And cities often find themselves in difficulty stretching their budgets to deliver all the different things they need to deliver. And so cities can borrow money from the markets, and that's one way of engaging with private capital. They can also create partnerships with private companies and get the private company to borrow the money. And then that debt won't appear directly on the city's balance sheet. And it can often be a more efficient way of managing access to capital. So we've got efficiency and access to capital. Those are the two core pieces. You will note that I said efficiency first. And generally speaking, when I speak to governments around the world, the first thing they want to hear about is money. And money is a lovely thing. Money is wonderful. We like more money, more investment. But the focus needs to be on efficiency. If the private partnership doesn't deliver better than what you could do by yourself, then you have to wonder if it's worth the challenges and the cost of bringing in a private investor. More on that later. By the way, I see there's a hand up already, but I think that was an old hand from before. Is there a question, or does someone want to raise a comment, or is that a historic hand?
Probably the old hand.
Okay,
Jeff.
I'm going to assume old hand, but if somebody wants to interrupt me, please feel free. So we talked about efficiency and how public and private together can deliver better than public by itself or private by itself. There's a third element, which is the financier. And so as we think about how to deliver these partnerships well, we need to think about the context of government, the context of the private investor, and also the context of the financier. Now, financiers look at projects in a very different way. Investors invest because they see big potential. They see an investment that could be bigger and bigger. And if they add efficiency, if they add new technology, if they add new ways of doing things, then private sector can make the project even more profitable. And so private sector loves that, right? If you can get more and more profits, that's much more exciting for the private sector. And the good thing for government, as long as the partnership is designed properly, more profits should only be available if the service and the delivery is better than it was before. So investors should only get more profits if services are that much better, efficiency is that much better, right? And so government and investor should win when there are big profits. The financier is a little bit different because the financier provides money generally, and this is the debt provider. They provide debt, and debt earns interest. Generally, interest does not increase if the project is very profitable. So the banks get their interest no matter what. So if the project is very successful, it doesn't make any difference to the banks. They're happy, but that's not what they're focused on. The banks are focused on the downside. If the project does not make as much money as hoped, then the revenues start going down. You're getting closer and closer to where you cannot repay the debt. And that's where the banks get nervous. So the banks are very focused on the negative, on the risks, on the downside. The investor is focused on the upside and the potential. And so you have these two parties connected and linked together who are pulling in slightly different directions. But together they make the project stronger. Then you have the third piece, which is the government, which is focused on quality of delivery, sustainability of that delivery over time, and making sure that the people, that the community is taken care of. So these three parties together make for a much stronger, more holistic project, but each with very different incentives and very different focus. And so my apologies, and I love using this image because it's very evocative. So apologies if this is a sensitive topic, but for me, PPP as a partnership, together 1 + 1 should equal 3, right? Public plus private should be better and bigger than each by themselves. And they should fit together like pieces in a puzzle, where one has a gap, the other fills that gap. And so, of course, the image that springs to my mind is marriage. And marriage is complicated and difficult and messy and hard work, and every day is hard work, but it is a beautiful thing. And if you work hard at marriage, at that partnership, you have two people coming together with very different strengths, with very different approaches to life. You have to work through and figure out how to work together. But once you figure out how to work together, that partnership, that marriage is so much stronger than what you could do by yourself. And I'll only speak for my marriage, but before I got married, I didn't realize, you know, when you're dating and everything's wonderful and lovely and you're romantic and all that wonderful stuff, and then you get married and reality starts, right? The wedding is not the marriage. The wedding is a big party and that's wonderful, but the marriage is tough. And so day one, you've got to start working at it. And I didn't realize how different men and women can be, how completely different way that they address issues and they address challenges and disputes and conflict and communication and all of those different things, and how those needs are different. And I'd always heard about this, but until you're in that kind of a relationship, it's impossible to know. And so PPP is very similar, because the public and the private approach things in a very different way. So don't be surprised when you start to engage with private partners that the way they're approaching things, the way they're pulling the project is a little bit different than what you would do, and maybe a lot different. And the need to communicate with each other, the need to help each other understand your concerns, your interests, where you're coming from, and then for you to try to understand where they're coming from and to understand their context is really, really important. So we're going to walk through the different pieces of one of these partnerships. And I'm not going to go into details of the contractual structures and all the rest. We could talk about this topic for weeks and weeks on end. I actually did a PhD on PPP, and there's still so much more to talk about it. There's just so much. It's a super, super interesting area, constantly learning. But I'm going to break down a couple of the pieces of this and start with the question, as a municipality, are you ready to partner with the private sector? So we said PPP is a little bit like marriage. As an entity going out and looking for a partner, which one of these two men do you want to be? Do you want to be our friend on the left, who is clearly running out, it's time to get married, and oh my gosh, I've got to get married? That sense of desperation, that sense of unpreparedness. He has clearly not prepared himself to go out and meet someone who's going to spend the rest of his life with. The young man on the right has taken a bit more time to prepare himself. He looked good. He's got the sharp suit. He's got everything going. He's taking care of his body and his hair, and he is just ready to go. And he's prepared himself for this partnership. And as a municipality, you need to prepare yourself. That will make you a stronger partner, and that will attract better partners. You'll have more options for investment if you've taken the time to set yourself up so that when the partner comes, the partner is comfortable, confident, and excited about the partnership because they see how much work you've put into it and how ready you are to move forward. And so understanding where the private sector is coming from and the difference between the way you make decisions and the way this private sector investor is going to make decisions is really important. I'm making reference here to a toolkit that we developed, that the World Bank developed for municipal PPP. I'll give you the web references later, but there are all kinds of different modules and pieces that you can read about all these different elements and assessment tools and all kinds of fun stuff. So that's what the tools and the modules you see referenced on the side. The other thing to not forget, looking at this picture, and we have our big sumo wrestler. And the sumo wrestler is standing across from this little tiny boy, and the little boy, bless him, is taking on the sumo wrestler, and he's ready to go. But between the public and private sector, which one is the sumo? Is the sumo wrestler the municipality, or is the sumo wrestler the private sector? What do you think?
เป็นไงครับตกลงท่านถ้าเกิดท่านนายกท่านว่าเป็นท่านเป็นตัวใหญ่หรือ
So,
ท่านเป็น
do
ตัว
you
เล็กค
think
รับ
that you're the bigger guy or the smaller guy, Mayers?
So when I speak to different groups around the world, the answers are incredibly varied. Some people say that the big guy is the private sector because the private sector has money, they've got lawyers, they've got bankers, they've got people, all these people arriving in beautiful suits and nice cars, and they come into the room and they know what they're doing and they've done projects all over the world, and poor little government sits on the other side of the table and doesn't have any experience in this. They're not really sure how to address the different issues. They don't know how to negotiate. They don't have the money to spend on expensive lawyers or expensive bankers or all those kind of things. And I can attest to this. When I was in the private sector, so many times I would advise a client and we would come into the room with all the lawyers and the bankers, etc. And there across the table was the government representative, and with very little resource and with no support around him. And so those conversations were very difficult because the government side didn't have the capacity to be able to engage on a proper partnership level. Now, the other argument is that the sumo is the government. And because the government has all the power. So as a private company, when you come to negotiate with the government, you realize that whatever you negotiate, the contract that you have, no matter how good your lawyers are, that contract is useful, but it doesn't guarantee you a good project or a successful project. The only thing that's going to make for a successful project is a good partnership between the government and the private sector. And you know that the government can change the rules whenever they want. They can change the law and the regulations. They can withhold permits. They can take land away. They can stop utilities. They can do all kinds of really difficult things. And it doesn't have to be big, obvious things. It doesn't need to be, nationalization of assets. It could well be something very small that's imperceptible, but destroys the project. And so as a private company, you're very nervous engaging with government, realizing that government could change the next day. The other difficulty is that you don't know who government is. A private company as an entity, even if management changes, the private company tends to keep the same focus, and they're in the same sector and they're doing the same things. For government, when there's an election, that might mean a whole new group of people with a completely different approach. And that gets really, really tricky for private investors. They don't want a deal for 2 years. They want a long-term deal that they know is going to succeed and that's where they get their big profits, is when you've got something that really works well and that's going to deliver over the long term. And so that nervousness about government changing is very real. And as government staff, we realize this, and you deal with it and you roll with that every time there's a new government. You sort of pause, adjust everything so it fits with the new policy, and you move on. Private sector doesn't really understand how that works, and they're not really built to be that flexible in that way. And a lot of PPP deals are not built to be that flexible. The idea is that you lock in an arrangement over time. It's a bit like your wedding vows. In the US, when you get married, you stand in front of the priest or whoever, and you make vows. You say, I promise that I'm going to be faithful and loving and kind and caring. And you go through a whole list and tell your spouse how much you love them and how you're going to be a wonderful spouse. Now, you tend not to, during marriage, I have never said, on our wedding day, you promised that you would be kind and caring and sharing. And so, I want it my way. I want to do it my way because you promised in our wedding that you would be nice to me and you would let me do what I wanted to do. That doesn't work, right? That's not a very healthy marriage. You can't point back to that promise and just pretend like that's going to be locked away forever. But you've got to have the kind of relationship where you can both compromise and roll off each other and work together to, if you're constantly trying to score points off each other or beat the other person, it's not a very strong relationship. And again, I find that to be true in PPP as well around the world, where I've seen really good deals, is where the two parties can sit down together and say, all right, there's an election coming up. This is going to happen. There's inflation at the moment, rampant inflation. What do we do? What was really impressive during COVID was seeing how PPP deals generally around the world, how governments dealt with them pretty well, in the private sector as well, because both sides knew that this was something nobody could control. This was not going to come out well for anybody. And so it was just a matter of doing our best to make the project work while COVID was exploding. And so all that extra work to talk and to communicate and to engage together, kinds of deals exploding, those deals actually survived much better than I thought. And I think a lot of that was down to people communicating and talking and sharing, which can be very powerful. So let's get back to our municipal readiness and talk through a couple of the different elements that, as a private sector, you want to see. Obviously, creditworthiness is a big deal. And this comes down to, effectively, is the city able to fulfill its promises? Can the city deal with the financial obligations of any kind of investment, any kind of a partnership, and will they? So do they pay their bills? Have they paid their bills in the past? Have you borrowed money in the past? Have you repaid that money properly? How do you set up your accounts? Are your accounts well managed? How transparent are these things? Often the cities run their accounts in a very different way, very internally focused and focused on meeting the requirements of national government, of satisfying requirements and regulations that are designed to engage the city within the larger government structure. here, private sector wants to see from the outside, they want to see a level of transparency. They want to understand your total exposure to other liabilities, debts, PPP, etc. That transparency is very important. The accountability of the city is very important. And the fulfillment by the city of its obligations, whether commercial or financial, is very important. So a city that has in the past always paid its bills on time, not played around with contractors, not squeezed contractors and made them wait long time for their money for no reason, not squeezed employees, taking care of these kind of relationships. That's a very powerful statement for investors. And investors want to see this. The better that creditworthiness of the city, the cheaper private capital will be, and the more you will have private investors coming to want to bid for your projects. So in addition to creditworthiness, so you see on the outside, we're looking in, what does that creditworthiness look like? What do the accounts look like? How are you setting up your accounts? Are you managing your liabilities well? Both direct liabilities and contingent liabilities? What does all of that look like, that financial case? The second piece is internal capacity. So we can see how well you manage your books and how well you manage your finances. How well do you manage yourself internally? How is the city organized? Is the staffing, is the structure pretty solid, robust? How long does it last? Does it get reformed every couple of years, and so you totally restructure and it's a fluid thing? Or they're very clear engagements that meet all of your different needs? And so we put on this map a few of the different pieces, but very much focused on this PPP structure. So who is the team that you're going to negotiate with as an investor? Is there a PPP team? What does that team look like? Do they know anything about PPP? If they do, if there's capacity in one place with people that have been trained in PPP, will they stay there? Because don't forget, within government, we like to move people around every couple of years to gain experience in different areas. That gets tricky in a very specialized area like PPP. And for this, in the PPP space, investors want to see a group of people that have not just the skills and knowledge, but also the clear mandate to carry the project through. And that's very tricky for investors. Within government, we know all the different people to talk to. We know how to bring issues around government and get approvals from different people and organize ourselves around different working groups in order to get things done. Private investors looking in on government find that to be bizarre. Private companies tend to be very streamlined when it comes to decision making. It's very clear who makes the decision and when. There may be a credit committee or a board that makes the big decisions. It's all fed up to them by different managers. It's a very different structure than within government. And so you need to help them understand how you work. How can they be comfortable that the people they're talking to know what they're doing and have the mandate and authority to do what they need to do? And there will always be other approvals, right, that you need to get. That's okay. Map those out. Make it very simple. Here are the 3 approvals you need to get. Here are the criteria that are applied to each of those approvals. That way, as an investor, when I come and look in, I say, okay, I understand this, tick, tick, tick. And then I can tick the box and I'm comfortable that I know what the rules are and how these decisions are going to be made and who's going to be working with me so that I know how this relationship is going to evolve. External assistance, and we heard earlier from the Ministry of Finance of all the external assistance that's available to help drive these deals, and which is fantastic. All of that is really important when you partner with. So in a lot of countries for the World Bank, we actually sit with the country government and work with them, and so they hire advisors, they hire all kinds of commercial people to come in and do the deal, put the deal together. We sit with the government and we help them, look at things and give them advice on different issues and as they evolve. And so we got this external assistance that you can access. And we do this, Asian Development Bank does this, Islamic Development Bank. There are a lot of different sources of this kind of support. And you can bring that capacity in, and that gets investors comfortable, that reassures them that you've got the kind of resource that you need to deliver the project. Planning and budgeting. And again, we heard this a couple times this morning, the importance of planning and budgeting. And this is all about structure. It's all about understanding how the project fits within the big picture. So there was mention earlier of the light rail project in Phuket and other cities, looking at mass transit, also noting from Bangkok that the mass transit is not necessarily the most, it does not necessarily cover its costs from its revenue, because ridership is never quite what we hoped. But the impact on the city is huge, and not just, you know, economically, environmentally, congestion, economic opportunities, creating, you know, pulling economic activity outside of the center so that you spread it out around the city, all kinds of huge advantages to mass transit, but it's an expensive undertaking. And so understanding how that mass transit system is going to fit within the other transit systems. So how does your LRT fit with your bus system? Fit with taxi systems, fit with rail systems? How does all that work together? How is it designed to fit within the commercial poles, the commercial areas of focus in the city, so that it's designed not for political reasons, but rather for commercial, structural planning, good planning reasons, and why it's set out that way? All of that gives private investors great comfort to know that their project is fitting within a grand scheme for the city that is not just a scheme that the present government has raised, the present mayor, but rather that future mayors are likely to agree that this is a good idea. The last thing you want is a project that the next government, the next mayor, is going to come in and say, this makes no sense. Why are you investing in this? And then scraps the project. Everyone loses then. Certainly the investors lose then. And then budgeting as well. And how is the money set aside? Where does the money come from? The more a project is a burden on government, and if it's going to start getting really expensive for government, it's going to be more and more of a burden over time. That's a bad news for an investor. Investors don't like that, because they know that it's likely something that in the future is going to have problems with government, because government doesn't want that burden anymore. And that's all very tricky. We talked a little bit about institutional mandate, but also thinking about municipality, regional government, provincial government, central government, how they all fit together. Where do the utilities? Are the utilities national state-owned enterprises? Are they local enterprises? How do the decisions get made? How does all this fit together? All of that is something that as government we tend to just sort of flow with, and we understand it, and it'll change, but we adjust. For private sector, this is a huge area of risk for them, because they don't understand it. They don't understand the power linkages and how that works. And so you need to help them. And I mean, generally domestic private sector will understand this a little bit better. But definitely the foreign investors that you might want to attract with new technology and new capital, they may have big challenges with this. So helping them through that will be very useful. Sitting above that is governing law. And so this is generally a national topic, but you'll also have local regulations and local decrees. But how does the governing law fit? And so where are there gaps? Where does this all work together? All of this stuff is much better for the city to think about first. Before you even start talking to a private partner, think of all these things, because the private partner is going to ask. They're going to want to know the answer to these. They're going to hire lawyers to tell them, but they're going to ask you, how does this work, and is this okay? And if you have good answers and you already have looked into this and you're already ready for them, then they're going to feel more important. They're going to feel like you're a better partner. So the more of this you can have ready to engage with them, the better. So that's about the municipality and getting the municipality ready. Let me pause just for a second. Any comments? I'm afraid because I've got my screen open. Because I've got my screen open, I can't see anybody raising their hand. So if you want to jump in, please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Let me pause for a second. And also for my translators, am I going too fast? Or is that okay?
Nope, you're fine, Jeff.
Oh,
This
good.
is perfect.
Well, I'm very impressed. That's usually get lots of complaints about going way too fast. So you guys are clearly you guys had fantastic translators. Good. So I will keep going. No comments, no questions. Does that mean in this audience you've all understood absolutely everything I just said? And you know everything there is to know about municipal readiness for investment?
I see some nods.
Yeah, fantastic. You guys are then fantastic. Glad to hear it. All right, let's talk with them now about projects, because once you've looked at the municipality and get the municipality ready for these kind of investment conversations, you need to look at the project itself. There. And so again, we've got the assessment tools. These are things that you'll be able to look at and sort of get a sense of some of the bigger questions and some of the challenges. And these issues will link back to a certain extent with some of the municipal readiness, but this will be focused on the project. So the experience looking around the world in a lot of projects that are put out by government, you will see projects that are selected based on political priorities. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but as a city, you have a certain amount of budget. Some of that budget is generated from property taxes and other local taxes and fees. Some of it is own source revenue, where you've got revenue generating activities in the city. And a lot of it, and in some cases, most of it, is coming from transfers from central government. Those, in particular, those transfers that are provided to you need to be spent within the year to demonstrate to central government that you've got the ability to spend money and to spend it well. And so as a city, if you have 10 projects that are viable projects, and these are things that you really want to get done, and you have enough money in your budget to do 7 of them. Let's keep this very simple. So 7 of the 10 you can pay for, and the other 3 you can't pay for. You don't have the money to pay for it. And 7 of those projects, 7 of them are easier than the other 3. 3 of the projects are very difficult. 7 are very simple. Now, as a city government, your natural reaction is to use your public money, your transfers from central government, to deliver the 7 easy projects. Then you can show central government, I've spent the money, I've spent it well, look at all these projects that I've done. You can go back to your councillors, you can go back to your to the people in the city and say, I've taken the money that I've had, I've spent it on these 7 projects, look how easy they were, how well I did them. And yes, there are these 3 that we didn't get done, but these are the 7 and we got them done. And then the other 3, what do you do with the other 3? The other 3, of course, get pushed to PPP. Let's get the private sector and let's get them to do these difficult projects, all right? That's a very natural reaction. That way the city looks good, they've spent their money, and then we give the other 3 to the private sector and hope that they can take care of those. Now, the money that you're getting and the money that you're earning, that you have available to you as a city, is the same price whether you use it to invest in easy projects or hard projects. Right? There's no differentiation. It's not deliverable based or anything like that. Most of it, there'll be some around the edges, but primarily it's about what can you deliver and what can you get done. Private capital, on the other hand, is much more expensive for risky projects. For difficult projects, the cost of capital is much higher because private sector will price money, in particular debt, based on risk. The higher the risk, the higher the premium that banks and investors will charge. So actually, financially, practically, this should all be flipped on its head. We should choose the projects, the easiest projects, and use those easy projects to bring in private investment, because that private investment will be cheaper. It'll be easier to get. You'll get more people bidding because they'll be more excited about the projects. The more difficult, risky projects, people are going to be less interested, less attracted. They're going to want much bigger returns on their investment. Their debt is going to be much more expensive because they're looking at all of this risk. So logically, you should flip it on its head, but actually within our government systems, that's really tricky to do. The other thing that's very tricky to do is spend money from the budget on preparing projects. It's much easier to spend money on building things, on bricks and mortar, on stuff. But to spend a lot of money on expensive advisors, on expensive designers, on people looking at risks and contracts and procurement processes and all these things, for many of our government systems, that's very difficult to do. And why? Because we want to push our government employees to try to deliver stuff with public money. And it feels like you're wasting money when you invest in all these advisors. But actually for PPP, again, you have to flip it on its head. All of those risk issues need to be addressed up front for a PPP project. You need to spend time and money preparing the project well. And the better prepared, the better the package, the better put together this project is, the more attractive it will be to bidders, the more bidders you will have come, and the cheaper the debt. Because the lenders and the investors will look at your project and say, all right, these guys really know what they're doing. They know what they want. They've spent the time, they've spent the money, and they've put this project together really well. Complete different logic to what we normally do, which is run out, get a project moving, and then ask all of those questions. So I start building so it looks like I'm making stuff happen so I can spend money. And then the money is spent ex post on asking those difficult questions. And then you make variations to the contract, you adjust the design, you build in all of those contingencies later on so that they can address these issues, and which you only identify later. Now, I'm not saying this just about Thailand, and I couldn't comment on whether maybe Thailand has this all sorted out and you guys never have these problems. But I tell you, in every other country I've been to, that's a big issue, including the US, the UK, all over Europe. There's a real challenge of the way government structures and spending structures fit within the dynamic of PPP and getting private investment in. And that's why our friends at the MOF set up these funds, set up capacity to help people put these PPP projects together, because you need that extra budgetary oomph, you need that capacity kick, and which is why people bring in the World Bank and IFC and other people to help make these things happen, because you do need to help the government and the city start to understand why the whole system needs to be flipped on its head. And they need to see proof of that before you go through the effort of changing the way the system works and putting the incentives in the right place. So that those preparatory funds and really looking at that preparation is going to be really important for the readiness of the project. As you do that preparation, you're going to have a much better understanding on the CapEx, the cost of capital, and the amount of capital needed, as well as the duration of the project and how long it's going to take to build, how long the concession, the contract is going to last. The more detail, the more well-developed you're thinking around that, the more comfortable an investor is, and the less an investor has to spend on doing its own work, analyzing the source of capital, the need for capital, etc. Stepping back a little bit, once you've figured out exactly what you want and how all that works, you need to work out what the legal basis is for that. And so teasing through the laws and regulations to make sure all of this is permitted. And where it's not, those changes in laws and regulations take time, right? It's not something you just snap your fingers and, some decrees can be done relatively quickly, but a lot of these things, especially when they're more fundamental, they really need the time and effort to make them happen. You don't want to do that after you've already signed the contract with your private partner, because the project will be designed such that these kind of legal political issues are governments risk, and you don't want to create extra liabilities for the project. So all those legal issues, to the extent possible, to the extent you can, ideally you deal with those in advance of the project. And then taking one step back is the project rationale. Why are we here? What is this thing? We talked earlier about planning and how the project fits into the planning. This project rationale has to be very concrete. It can't be based on a grand dream that the president has for the future of the country, right? Those are all wonderful, but that doesn't give an investor a lot of concrete faith that this is going to happen, right? That you have to wonder what's going to happen when the next president comes in, or when the next mayor comes in, or government comes in, or the next grand scheme comes in. You want something that's pretty concrete and solid. And so that rationale is going to be really important. And this is the question about planning and preparation. So as you're thinking about rationale, as you're thinking about the concrete project itself, how risky, how complicated, how difficult is this? Is this a project that everyone else has rejected and nobody else wants to do? And so you've handed it off to a private investor? Or is this a project that you have identified as being best delivered by a private entity? And what is called a value for money? Where am I going to get the best value for the public investment in preparation and in participation in this project? Where am I going to get the best value for the government? And the more you can show that this project provides best value and meets the needs of government, the more confident and comfortable an investor will be. And this pyramid in the middle represents that flipping of the thought process, and of choosing instead of just looking at what projects I'd like to do with public, and then all the leftovers I either give off to state-owned enterprises or I give to the private sector. Instead, flip it the other way around and ask, who would be best placed to do this? That means inserting into the planning process consideration of private investment, consideration of the needs and demands and opportunities for private investment. And that way, when the private sector says, oh, well, tell me more about your vision for this project, where did this come from? You can show them that you've actually thought through why this is a great deal, why it's ideal for a private investor, what you want from those private investors. The better you can explain to them what you want from them, the easier it will be for them to deliver what you want. And they'll want to do that so they can win the bid. So the better you can describe in the bid documentation as you're developing the project, the better you can describe what this looks like, the easier it will be for them to bid for the project, because now they'll know what you want. All that sounds easy, but knowing what you want is very difficult, because there's no you, there's no individual. There are all kinds of different people and constituencies around local government, central government, regional government. They've got a lot of different people who will want things out of this project, and they may not tell you right away. So you'd have to put out there some ideas and some concepts and do a lot of consultation, a lot of bouncing ideas around before you get a very clear view of what you want to do. And that can be frustrating for municipal government. Municipal government, the mayor's only in for a few years. The mayor wants to get stuff done now. So let's go, let's start spending, let's start building. And when you come back and say, well, let's talk about it, let's make sure everybody's on the same page, let's do some preparation, let's do some studies, that sounds like you're dragging your feet. It sounds like you don't want to get things done, when actually it's quite the opposite. Actually doing those studies first and doing that thinking first will make the rest of the project faster, right? And you've all seen this, right? You start to do the project fast, everybody go, 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 go. You go out there, you sign a construction contract, everybody gets out, you get shovel on the ground so we can take photographs and everything's great. And then the first variation comes in, and then the first problem arises. And then, oh, we didn't realize that, you know, the village school is right down the street and it's going to be too much traffic. Didn't realize that the power lines went through this property, and so it's going to be complicated. All those kind of things come up later because we didn't do the studies. We didn't ask the questions first. And again, this isn't any commentary on Thailand. This is, the UK when they did the new lines for their metro. Those lines came out 2, 3, 4 times the price that were originally assessed. And that's kind of, unfortunately, a normal thing, especially for mega projects in the public sector. Part of the reason for that is that there is a natural incentive within government for us to underestimate price. Because when you go to the city council, you go to the mayor, you go to a decision maker and suggest a project with a realistic price tag, it sounds too expensive. And there is a pressure, whether conscious or unconscious, to push that price down and to assume efficiency, to assume no problems, to assume that everything's going to work perfectly, and to put a very small price on it, and then get government to agree to it. And then as you go down the design phase, the price gets bigger and bigger, but the government's already agreed, so it's a little bit too late. And unfortunately, in some countries, you have to almost lie about the actual price of the project in order to get it through those initial approval processes. Private sector isn't comfortable with that. They don't tend to have to do, they tend to do very robust assessments of cost. And if there's any failure in the assessment of cost, there will be a massive problem internally, because squeezing that extra money out is not it's not that it's easy in government, but it's a different dynamic. And so the private sector will want to see realistic numbers, and they will come forward with realistic numbers and won't understand when government has put an overly optimistic number against either the capital cost or maintenance costs or operating costs. And private sector will have a hard time playing that game. Even worse, the private companies who are willing to go along with a fiction like that are probably not the partners you want, because they will benefit from that fiction. Because as you go forward with the project and you have to add costs and make variations, those variations are very expensive in PPP, because the whole financial structure is based on the original assumption of costs.
คุณเจฟครับถามหน่อยได้ไหมฮะ
I ask a question?
Yes, please.
คือนั่งฟังอยู่เนาะแล้วก็
As I'm listening,
มันมีแปลมาด้วยเนาะเนี่ย กำลังจะถามว่า
I'd like to ask you a
ที่เจฟบอก
question.
ว่า
As you said,
มันมีความจำเป็นที่ต้องเตรียมโครง
there's
การ
a
เนาะ
need to prepare for the
แต่ในอี
project,
กข้อหนึ่ง
correct?
เนี่ยก็คือว่า
But one
เทศ
thing
บาลเองเนี่ย
is that the municipality.
พูดแล้วมันมีเสียงฟัง พูดแล้วมันพูด
Sorry,
ไป
there's an echo in the meeting room, and therefore he's speaking about it.
ไม่เป็นไรครับเดี๋ยวลองดูคือ
It's okay. Let me
เดี๋ยวคน
try
แปลอย่าเพิ่ง
again.
แปลได้ไหมฮะเพราะว่ามันเสียงมันเข้ามาในห้องแล้วมันพูดมันฟังไม่รู้เรื่อง เดี๋ยวผมสรุปเป็นภาษาอังกฤษให้เจฟได้บอกเจฟ
Okay.
หน่อย
So he's gonna ask me not to translate, and he's gonna recap because there's an echo in the meeting room.
Oh, okay.
คือที่เจฟบอกเนี่ยก็คือว่าหนึ่งนะฮะตัว PPP เนี่ยมันเหมือนกับแต่งงานเนาะเราต้องเตรียมตัวแต่งตัวเพื่อที่จะเป็นที่ดึงดูดให้คนมาลงทุนร่วมทุนกับเราใช่ไหมฮะในขณะเดียวกันข้อที่สองเนี่ยก็พูดถึงว่าเทศบาลเนี่ยก็ต้องมีศักยภาพมีหน่วยทำ PPP ใช่ไหมฮะเพื่อแต่งตัวโครงการคือสองเรื่องนี้พอมันอยู่ในบริบทไทยปุ๊บเนี่ยมันยากละนะคือตอนนี้เราอาจจะมีไอเดียแน่ๆแล้วที่เทศบาลเนี่ยไอ้ที่งานประจำที่วิ่งอยู่เนี่ยทำไม่ทันเลยนะจะเอาคนที่ไหนนะขึ้นมาเตรียมโครงการเพื่อให้มันดูหล่อดูเท่เพื่อจะไปดึงดูดใช่ไหมผู้ลงทุนคือมันไก่กับไข่มันเลยเดินไม่ได้แล้วเปล่านะที่ผมสงสัยแล้วก็อยากจะฟังจากเจฟด้วยเจฟjust trying to help stimulate sort of conversation here because your 2 points particularly on the merit right one there's a real need to prepare projects for PPP right and you need capacity and you need money to prepare right to make it sexy and attract investments but capacity municipal capacity and it was your question whether municipality here is ready I can tell you that they're not ready with the capacity they have, running around on providing services. They don't have enough people. They have ideas of what to do, right? For different investments, but certainly no capacity, no people to sit and prepare the projects good enough to go out and attract investments. So what's your thought on that? What would be your reaction to that?
Yeah, so I think it's great that you're honest about that. A lot of countries are nervous about being honest about the fact that this is big and complicated, and they may not have that capacity. I think it's true around the world. Municipalities in particular don't have excess capacity. You don't have people sitting around looking for work to do. You have people who are way too busy, and so you providing these extra tasks, and until the PPP program gets moving, in most countries, in most places we work, there is a need to bring in external capacity. So to bring in advisors, to bring in teams of consultants, either from consulting firms or individuals, to come and sit with the city staff and to do all of the heavy lifting work. The city staff still need to do the thinking and the strategic analysis and make decisions about risks in particular. But there's a lot of capacity out there globally that can be brought to bear. So for a typical project, we would hire a transaction advisor to help the city and to sit with the city and do all the heavy lifting to put together the project, to do the analysis, to do the studies, to do the procurement process, to reach out to investors and do market consultation. And that's where, for instance, this fund that the MOF was talking about earlier, that fund can be used to pay for those expensive advisors. There are other sources of capital for, and obviously, World Bank and ADB and others, there are some trust funds that can be brought in to help. Now, Thailand is a wealthy place, relatively speaking, so it's a little harder to get trust funds to support projects in Thailand, but there are a few that would be very interested in doing so, especially depending on the nature of the project, and we can talk about that separately. So completely understand that this seems like too much work, and it is a lot of work, but there are resources out there to help you get it done. And once you've done the first couple of projects, then the capacity is being built within the city, and then it gets much easier. But those first projects are very difficult and require quite a bit of investment of money. There's also the question about the municipal readiness. And there again, it's not something that you have people sitting around, waiting to look at restructuring institutions and changing regulations and laws. And so there again, we tend to hire in advisors who will help think through changes, who will help map out these solutions. You still need municipal staff to guide that process and to make the ultimate decisions. But an awful lot of that work can be outsourced to consultants.
Thanks. I think I'll let you proceed, Jeff.
Okay. And thank you for the question.
Wait up. Jeff, sir?
Yes.
My name is John from Lumpia Municipality, which is a very small municipality. I got a question. We have 2,275 municipalities in Thailand right now, and among 2,000, there are only few, like maybe 70 big municipality, like the city of Pattaya, like Phuket, Rayong, stuff like that. Okay, because we have our own duties to our people, and we have our own works. And why do we have to attract investor to do PPP? Normally, we have our own work already. We got the money from the central government yearly. We have yearly budget, already, and some from time to time, we also get extra money, from a special budget. Depends on our duties. So why do we have to attract PPP? Because because everything that in our work, in our area is belong to us already. Why do we need to because the private is doing better,
Exactly. So, and it's an excellent question, and that's a great problem to have, to not need the private sector. That's great. And remember that my first comment about the two things that we try to do with the private sector. One is efficiency, try to bring in new technology, new ideas, new efficiency. So if there's something that one of these tasks that you're currently doing with public resources and capacity, and you think that a private company could do it better, could bring in new technology, could expand in new directions, when you're looking at innovative solutions, innovation labs, new tech, smart street lighting so that you can gather data for all kinds of different things. Some of that technology might be easier, better to do with a private partner rather than directly by the city. There may be different technologies you want to bring to bear on, new water treatment or something like that. But if it's not the case, if you are happy with the services that you got and you're doing just fine on your own, forget it. Don't do PPP, for heaven's sake. Don't add the complication to your life. You don't need it, right? If you're happy with the efficiency that you're getting and you don't think a private partner could do any better, that's great. And the second is capital. And so sometimes a lot of cities turn to PPP because they just don't have the money to do all the things that they need to do. The new investment will create revenues, and so you will have the money in the future. But today you don't have the money, you don't have the capital, and so you can't make this investment. And so cities will turn to PPP to bring in that new capital. But in your case, it sounds like you've got enough capital to do what you want to do. And that's fantastic. And in particular, a municipality that is, relatively small. I can't. So I've worked on really tiny PPPs. I did a project, a community water project in Africa that were, investments of a few $1,000s. And it was basically a private company that was going around to villages, digging wells, installing pumps, solar power pumps, and then installing a very small pipe network around the village. So it's not a huge CapEx, very small CapEx, very easy to maintain. You just had to come around and check the kit every couple of months. But the villages didn't have the money and they didn't really know how to set these things up and maintain them. So having the private partner was very useful. They brought in the capital, they brought in the efficiency, but they were little tiny investments. So even in tiny communities, you'll have, and I'm sure you already do versions of PPP, right? You've got engagements with private sector and they're doing things for you on a long-term basis and they're taking some of the operation risk. But I completely agree with you. If you're happy with what you got, you're doing well with it, and you've got enough money, then why bother?
Thank you.
Cool. So let me keep going, but again, yell out if you've got another question or comment. Very interesting. It's much more interesting when you guys talk. When I talk, it's very boring. So, so we talked about preparation of these projects, getting everything put together. The next question is competition. I am a big believer in the competitive process. Now I know that there are.
Jeff, sorry, can you
Yes.
check if there's a hand on? It looks from my outside like there's somebody raised their hand.
Yes, is there a hand up? Oh yeah, great. Please.
จะรบกวนถามคุณเจฟนิดนึงนะครับว่า
So I'd like to ask Jeff,
การที่ดึงภาคเอกชนมาร่วม
when we attract the private sector to reduce the conflict in the project? My question is that when the municipality works on that, maybe we have the budget, but the problem is the conflict that happens from the implementation. And when we create the PPP, do you think it will reduce that conflict and increase the understanding? Like, should we approach with PPP?
Oh, and could you tell me more about the conflict? Is this the tension between public and private, or the tension with the community? What is the conflict?
ครับคือเหมือนกับตอนนี้เทศบาลอยากจะเข้าไป
So the municipality wants to create a market, and in this market, there is an issue of sanitary. It's quite old. So in the past, there was a problem that could not be solved. And this is a market that belongs to other government agency, the railroad department. And so the people made a complaint to the municipality that you should come in and manage this. But the municipality sees that if we go in there alone, it will be very difficult to dissolve this. But if we bring PPP into this, because then we can involve the department who has the ownership of this old market, and then have a third party coming in to negotiate with the community also. So, Kun Jeff, do you think it will be beneficial, or should municipality lead this, or should we bring private sector in? But we also have a private company trying to solve this, but it didn't work out. So the people came to us because they relied on us.
That's a really, really interesting question. And I've seen this in a number of different cases. And to be very honest, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the situation on the ground and the people involved. In some cases, municipalities, especially where there's a central government parties who are responsible for different pieces, maybe they own the land. I've seen some projects where the Ministry of Transport through the Railways Authority owned the land, and so you built the market on the land. They've got control of the land and they don't know what to do with the market, but it's theirs, so they don't want to let go. They certainly don't want the municipality to take control. It is possible to use PPP as a platform that equals everyone out. And so because it's PPP, and especially where you can bring in someone like our friends from the Ministry of Finance, or sometimes they bring in people like the World Bank. And when we come in and sit in the middle, where the Ministry of Transport, in my example, is nervous about the municipality taking control or taking over their asset, when you have somebody from the outside creating and helping you create this PPP, and it's a private entity that does it, and the Ministry of Transport can point to that and say, we're doing a PPP. Isn't that interesting? Or isn't that cool? Or that's the latest thing, or central government loves PPP, so they look good. And then they've got a neutral party that's managing this market. And then the questions that you ask become very practical. So it's no longer a philosophical question about who controls what and who's responsible for what and who's the more important political player. Now it's about, how do I make this market work and how do I make it commercially viable? And markets, by the way, are fascinating projects for PPP. A lot of really cool opportunities to create revenues around markets. You can use that platform of the PPP to bring people around the table and to get them to talk about what they really want, and which they might not do in a political context, in a government-to-government context. So it can create an opportunity to bring people together. That said, it is also getting a lot of different players controlling one project. And so it can get very messy. So there was a water treatment project that we supported in Indonesia, and it was 6 different municipalities. One municipality had the water source. The 5 municipalities wanted to buy the water from the first municipality, and water is power. So it was very contentious political discussion, and it took decades for them to decide. But eventually we decided on a PPP structure. And so the PPP structure had the one private entity that then allocated water to the different municipalities. And because it was PPP, you had to think about what happens if there's a drought? What happens if there's a storm? What happens if there's a break in a pipe? Who gets what water? How do we allocate it? And it created an opportunity to be very concrete, but it was very, very complicated because you had so many different, as we say in England, we had so many different cooks in the kitchen. And when you have one kitchen and 5 different cooks, what you get out of it can be pretty complicated. But at the end of the day, we were able to solve the problem, and we put the thing together. But you might want to think about who are the constituencies from the outside of this dynamic that can help solve or be the center of gravity, the weight that pulls these different parties together around this PPP project. And if the community is already reaching out to you, that's great. You know, it's fantastic that they have trust in you and that they're looking to you to help them solve this problem. Cool. So any other questions, thoughts, comments? Okay, I will go on, but please do feel free to interrupt me. So I'm a big believer in competition. I know there are cases where you have a direct negotiation with a private party or a private party that comes forward with a good idea and you choose to go with that private party. I know there are good examples of that, but I've not seen many. I've seen far more terrible examples of government wanting to go fast. And because they want to go fast, they don't want to go through a procurement process. They just want to choose someone. And then they choose someone, and that someone doesn't have the ability or doesn't have the money or doesn't have the interest, and the whole thing falls apart. So I'm a big believer in competition. I also think that private entities like competition. They don't like it, but they like it. Because when private entities compete with each other, it makes them stronger. It makes them more creative. It forces them to do better, which if you just hand them something, it tends to be not the case. And so I'm a big, big believer in that competition. And in the same way, thinking about the marriage image, I have a daughter who is 14 years old and is beautiful and amazing and the most incredible creature ever created. And when it's time someday for her to find a husband, I'm hoping she's going to be very, very choosy. And she's going to make these guys compete and see which one is the best. Not the first, not the easiest, but the best. Because it's a long-term relationship. And the same way marriage is a long-term relationship, PPP is a long-term relationship. You're going to be with these people for a long time. So it's worth taking the time to compete and get the best. I think we've already looked at a bunch of this. So one thing that we're going to talk about in a little bit is revenues and making sure that the project revenues make sense, that it's not just dreams and aspirations. Oh, we're very hopeful that we're going to get this amount of demand, or, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we had all of these different people shopping at our public market. There was a study done, almost 20 years ago now, on traffic forecasts for roads. And when you want to build a PPP road, you do a detailed set of traffic forecasting. The investor does a traffic forecast, the government does a traffic forecast, and the lenders do a traffic forecast, because they're all going to make their money off of cars on the road. And they did a study Standard & Poor's did a study over a bunch of years and looked at traffic forecasts, and everyone was overly optimistic. the government and investors were the most optimistic. And I think the traffic on those roads was on average 60%, 60% of the amount that they thought it was going to be. And so the eventual traffic was much, much lower, 2/3 of what they thought it was going to be. And the lenders were more conservative. And so they were still optimistic. So their traffic was 3/4 of what they thought it was going to be. So traffic is always the assumptions around revenues are always carefully reviewed. The more you can be honest about it, the more you can be rigorous about what those revenues are going to look like and how they're going to change. And are they going to be affected over time by different events and risks and things? All of that's really important to think through in advance and to be very clear on so that you don't get yourself in trouble. Thinking about your average investment, and if you look at this on the left-hand side, your typical PPP, the first couple of years, you're spending money. You're throwing money into an empty hole because the asset has no value until it's built. So you want to build a new public market, you tear the thing down, you rebuild the whole thing. For 2 or 3 years, you have no revenues because you're building your public market. It's only after it's built that it starts earning revenue. And so this is the typical profile of a PPP project. And you can see from a lender and investor perspective, those first 3-4 years are really scary because you're just throwing money into this thing. And if you look at the profile, the early years are all catching up on debt. It's all repaying debt. And then it's later on that the dividends really start to catch up. And that's where it gets really profitable. But it's a really, really tricky financially. The more risk there is of delay in the early period of revenues lower than we thought, that could be a dramatic problem for private sector. And so they will look at that very closely. And all of that feeds off of risk, right? What risk, who's going to bear which risk? If the construction is late, who bears that risk? Well, there are a lot of reasons why construction can be late. So you have to go through all the different details and just think about all these different pieces. And it's actually a really, really interesting process. It's things that for a public project, you just sort of ride out and you figure it out as you go generally. But for a PPP, you've got to think about all this up front and decide who takes which risk. Whereas for a normal public project, government takes all the risk. So it's not as much of an issue, but it's even more of an issue. This asks all these questions up front, which frankly, for public projects, we should do the same thing. In the UK, when they had their big PPP program, they learned all of these lessons and they now apply them to their public projects. So the same team that was managing the PPP unit now has been brought into Treasury and manages all capital investment projects, whether PPP or public. So they've taken all these good lessons from the PPP program and they apply them to the big public investments. And they've had a huge impact on that. They've had really great results off of that program. But also realizing that there's a tendency to say, all right, risk, let's put it all in the private sector. Let's make them take all that risk. But the private sector will charge a risk premium. The more risk they bear, the more they're going to charge. And so the more government is going to have to pay. The more value is pulled out of the project to protect the private sector from these risks. So you've got to be really careful not to put too much risk in. Also, the more risk you put on, the fewer bids you're going to get. So getting that balance of risk allocation, risk mitigation is really important to get a valuable project and get to the right partner. Being too aggressive with risk is going to squeeze out partners, are going to make your project too expensive. Being too cautious with risk and keeping it all becomes too expensive for government and becomes a huge burden on government and makes the project unsustainable. So you want that nice balance between the two. Technical risks, analyze the project, what technology you're using, what does the site look like, how long is it going to take to acquire the site, all those things that we normally look at in a public project, we look at very basically when we start the project, and then we deal with those issues down the line. Again, we need to front load all of that risk analysis, and we need to think about the concepts, the environmental and social site risks, all of the community engagement, community risk resettlement, all of those kind of things need to be addressed up front, because your private investors are going to want to know about all this. They're going to ask these questions. You've got to be ready to answer them. And if you've asked these questions, it gives you power, makes you more powerful in the negotiation, makes you more powerful in managing the project, because you can manage those risks properly and reduce the impact of them later. A legal risk, of course, very important. So laws, regulations, changes in laws, the way things evolve over time, how do you adjust for that and how do you think about it? Are there gaps or challenges in the middle that could be resolved in advance or that need to be resolved through the structure of the deal, and ways to address those risks as you go? The nature of the contractual authority, the mandate of the entity that's signing the contract, all of those kind of things need to be sifted through to make sure that there's nothing glaring that's going to pop up at the last minute. And don't forget, government's going to look at these things, but then investor will look at them, lenders will look at them, they will come out. And if you push it off until later and you hope that it disappears, it probably won't. And if you push it off to later, it's going to get more expensive. Because the later you look at it, the fewer bidders will come, because they'll see that, oh my gosh, they haven't thought about these risks. A lot of them will back out. You'll only get a few bidders. Those bidders will bid higher prices, and you'll get a messier project because all this is being addressed at the last minute. Much better to think about these things in advance. And liabilities for government on the right-hand side, talking about contingent liabilities. It's again very tempting to think, well, this isn't going to arise for a few years, right? If this blows up, it's the next government that has to deal with it. And that may be the case, but it's going to end up making your project more vulnerable. It's going to make it less sustainable, because there will be this underlying bubbling risk that's underneath it that creates nervousness, both amongst investors and financiers, because they will look at this, they'll see it, they'll know that government might be liable for this. And it may be that they don't want to come invest in the project because they don't believe the government will be able to deal with it. The government won't be able to pay for it or absorb the risk when it arises. So ignoring risk or putting it shoving it under the carpet is not an option and does not help. It's also worth asking in the early days of your investment, how much interest you see out there from investors. And in some cases, the investors won't be aware of the project. It's, maybe there are a lot of reasons why they won't have expressed their interest. But what we tend to do with our advisors when we hire them to support government is to ask them to do some very early stage market consultation, just to sort of get out there and not pushy, not aggressive, not big splashy stuff, but just talk to a few people and get some feedback on how projects look and, early perceptions of risk and other things. And that can be really helpful to help government understand how these risks and these issues are being perceived from the outside. Can also start people talking, and that can be helpful. All right, you're not promising them the project's going to be anytime soon, but people start talking about the project and angling for it and thinking about it. And then when you are ready to come to market, they've already got that in the back of their heads. They're already thinking about this opportunity. And especially if you've taken the time to develop it well, when it comes out, you've created this anticipation, and then the product comes out and it's really positive and really solid. And that the combination of that can create a really nice virtuous circle of appetite. Just checking time. We've got another 15 minutes, is that right? So anybody can tell me, how long do we have? I don't want to overstay my welcome. Okay.
Yes, we have until 3:30, Jeff.
3:30. Okay, good. So let me chew through this. I want to talk very quickly about revenues. We talked earlier about sustainable projects and robust financials and all those good things. Let me do a quick on this, and we're doing a bunch of work on this in the World Bank. We will come back to you in another 3-4 months with something a bit more developed. But we want to help governments think more about revenues. We have a tendency in infrastructure to look at a project and to say, users should pay. And if users can't pay, if it's too expensive, then government should pay. And it's this dichotomy, users or government. The problem is that one, government often doesn't have the money. And two, it creates a burden on government that makes government uncomfortable with the project and makes government vulnerable. So the more we can find other sources of revenue to fill the gap between users and government, the more robust the project will be. And so what we're looking at is ways of capturing value, first of all, from land. So let me take your public market example, which is one that I enjoy public markets for a number of reasons. But normally you think, all right, I've got a public market. It's going to cost me $10 million to build this public market. The users, the people the vendors in the public market aren't going to give me very much money. So it's going to be a little tiny amount of money that they give me for the different stalls. That money will go for operations and maintenance. There's a little bit on CapEx that it'll protect me, but otherwise all the CapEx goes to government. But actually, when you build a public market, all the land around the public market becomes much more valuable because the businesses can develop around that public market. They can provide all kinds of different services. They feed off of the energy, the economic energy that's created by the public market. Why shouldn't those businesses share in the cost of the public market? And why shouldn't the project of the public market also leverage those commercial activities? So here in our little diagram, we talk about direct beneficiaries, which is important, but then looking at land value captures, the increase in land. Sometimes property taxes take care of that, but there are a lot of different mechanisms to look at to capture the value from land. And only part, right? We want everyone to benefit. We want people to make money off of infrastructure. We want to create business opportunities, but a piece of that should come back to help the government build the asset. And that just encourages government to build more assets and to create more economic opportunity. So a piece from the land value, but also the commercial opportunities. And how do we capture those commercial opportunities better within the project itself? So just to give you an example, here's a bus terminal in India. Bus terminals are great projects for these kind of commercial value capture. They built the terminal. They were going to make all their money off the bus fees, the fees that they charge to the buses. And then guess what happened? As usual, the buses didn't stop in the terminal. They stopped down the street. And they picked up all the people down the street, and the people would hang out in the terminal and then walk down the street and take the bus. And so there was no revenue for the bus terminal, or very much less revenue than they thought. So then they flipped the whole project around and they developed out pieces of it so they could have commercial activities, retail, investments, all kinds of different activities in the bus terminal that then leverages. And I think in Thailand, you talk about TOD, transit-oriented development, to describe a lot of this energy. But each one of these kind of assets has so much commercial energy in and around it. Street lighting. This is a project where the private investor received a proportion of the reduced cost of electricity to the city because they brought in LED street lights, smart street lights. They could reduce energy consumption. And so the energy savings were captured by the private sector, and the city ended up paying much less money each year on electricity, and they got new street lights. In another project in Nairobi, they built out a new streetlight system. The government still paid for electricity, but the streetlights themselves, they got for free because they allowed the private sector to put little advertisements on each streetlight. And the advertising revenue was enough to pay the cost of the streetlights. Here's an old marketplace in a public market in the Philippines that was actually burned down. It was sat there for more than a decade. It was a horrible blight. They had all kinds of parking problems. It was going to cost them $100 million to rebuild the market. And so that was going to be at least $10 million a year in the cost of repaying the capital and all the rest. But instead, they brought in a private party. The private investor made the market on the ground floor. And you can see down here, the public market is the ground floor. And then the top floors are other commercial, restaurants and other retail and movie theater and a bowling alley and all kinds of, and a big parking garage. Parking is always useful, especially in a city like Manila. And so the government, instead of having a cost every year, they now have a share of revenue and they make money off the project. Here's a school building in Washington, D.C. that actually is not too far from where I used to live in Washington. It was an old rundown building. They were going to have to close it down because it didn't meet any of the health requirements. But it had a relatively big plot of land. So they cut the land in half. They took half the land and they built apartments. And the other half, they rebuilt the school. And now it's one of the best schools in Washington, D.C. It's got all the latest equipment, all the latest capacity, and it's a fantastic school. And that was done off the strength of the parents. The parents in the school got together and drove all of this, which is fantastic. Here's a parking congestion issue in Peru. And there were two different cities that did this, but this is in the main business district. Parking all over the place, huge congestion, huge problems. And so they dug out the entire street and put parking garage underneath. And they put in bollards and things, protection so that you could not park illegally on the street. But you had a parking garage underneath, so you had no excuse. And then they make money off the parking garage. And again, it's a revenue that goes back. In the other one, in the other of these two cases, it was a public park. Public park in town. It was all falling apart. They needed money. And so they dug out the park and they put a parking garage underneath. And they used the revenue to rebuild the park and to create revenue stream. Turkey, beautiful old buildings that were all dilapidated. Here's an example. You were asking about central government and local government working together and different entities. This is one where there was a ministry of historical buildings, another central ministry, and then the city where the building was located. And they couldn't figure out how to work together, and it was messy, and there were years and years of sitting around. And they finally did a PPP, and they used the PPP to bring everybody together. And there were a few really dynamic champions that pushed the project through. But then they refurbished the whole thing. It's now it's a magnet for tourism, lots of retail space, and lots of property development. So they made a bunch of money off of it. There's a library and a fire department in Washington, D.C. Usually not something you think about PPP for a library and a fire department. But again, old buildings dilapidated, falling apart. And so they refurbished it. They built, on top of the library, they built a condominium. The condominium paid for a beautiful new library, a beautiful new fire department. And on top of the fire department, they put low-cost housing, because nobody else wants to live on top of a fire department, but low-cost housing you could put there. And that they got some central government funding for the low-cost housing. And so that project worked out very well. So in these guidelines that I told you about, we've got, and this is the website. We've got 106 of these different examples, I think, which are really fun to read through and just think about some of the options and opportunities. And I'm done. And 3 minutes to spare. Any questions, comments? We've got 3 minutes left. So any questions or comments?
Jeff?
No, deafening silence. You all want to go off for coffee, is that right?
No? Hello? Can you hear
Very
me?
impressed you sat through listening to me talk for so long.
Can you hear me, Jeff? Hello?
Jeff, someone's speaking, but I'm not sure if you can hear him.
Nope.
Kun Suradet.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
He's trying to talk to you still, but
Okay.
you don't hear him.
Sorry, I missed
Maybe
that.
can you go to the floor? Can you
could you
go
say it again?
select the original, please?
Can you hear me? Jeff? Maybe
Jeff,
you are...
can you select?
Oh, there we go. There we go.
Original, okay.
Do it again.
Hello?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay. Really hard. So, Suradet from KKTT Khon. Yeah. Thank you very much for your explanation. I think it's a lot of people can understand. But like what the first question, that the documentation for the local government that we are doing now is totally different from what the PPP need. That is our experience from Khon Kaen. That most of our local governments still not understand what kind of document, what format of document that they need to make it happen. On this one, that I think this one World Bank can help a lot on this one. I think, and me and Ajahn Mem and Ajahn Pun is also thinking that we want after we have your comments and everything on this part is really important. Can you share a little bit about the process of the documentation that all the other countries they are doing on this on the project for the PPP?
Absolutely. So the documentation is a little bit different because you need to think about a different sharing of risk and a different time frame for the project. So your normal construction contract for a public project, it needs to be stretched out to address other issues. If that on the website that I showed you a minute ago, there's also a sample concession agreement. And it's a sample of the agreement that you would sign with a private entity. It's a very simple one. You need to change it a lot for whatever your needs are, but at least it's a good example. When in the early days of PPP, we used to take construction contracts, exactly like the one that you mentioned, and adjust them and add pieces into them and fold stuff together to bring in the operation and the risk pieces and the financing pieces. So it's certainly doable, but there's a lot of material out there and a lot of available material that can really help you not start from the beginning, but to work from things that are familiar. That question about familiarity of government is really tricky, because even if you have a team that has good advisors and you get everything put together and everything's great, you still have to bring that to your to the council or to other decision makers who will not understand. And you're asking them to do something different. And that is always tricky. And again, that may be a place that we can help, because maybe we can help them understand that what you're proposing is typical of what other countries are doing. And that can give them a little more comfort, but it's not that process. I mentioned earlier, those first projects are the most difficult. And that's one of the reasons, is because you need to provide that capacity, that learning across the government.
Yeah, thank you very much. Because of especially in the council, they still have some opposition that they will ask some question that is very difficult to answer on that one. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Another question? For the meeting room or Zoom? Any question? โอเคนะครับ ถ้าไม่มีต้องขอบพระคุณมากๆครับ
So if there's no
Dr.
questions, I'd
Jeff
like to
นะครับ
thank
ในโอกาส
Dr.
นี้
Jeff
ผมขออ
for
นุญาต
your
เรียนเชิ
presentation.
ญ
May I
ท่านนายกขจรเกียรตินิพัฒน์โพไค
Major
นะครับ นายกเทศมนตรีตำบลลำพญาจังหวัดนครปฐมนะครับ
Lampaya
กล่าวขอบคุณ
Mayor
Dr. Jeff
to
Delmon แล้วก็
give
คุณขวัญพัฒน์
speech
สุท
to
ธิธรรม
thank
กิจครับ ขอ
คุ
เรี
ณ
ยนเชิญ
Jeff
ครับ
Delmon and Mr. ขวัญพัฒน์สุทธิธรรมกิจ
Hi again. On behalf of Municipal League of Thailand and all the attendants in this room and also on online streaming, I think that I would like to say that it is very beneficial to our society, you know, and it would what all the content that you share with us. Municipality that would fit. I myself will dress up beautifully, you know, looking for a new partner, you know. Also we'll do that to And again, on behalf of Municipal League of Thailand, thank you so much. And I hope to see you again, sir. Thank you, sir.
Fantastic. Thank you.